Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of me teaching you about AP Environmental Science. Today's lesson is 9.8. It's the third lesson of Unit 9 that I've stuck into Unit 2, and whatever. We're moving through. I've been hinting at talking about invasive species, so without further ado, let me get into it. Now, according to the College Board, what should you know? You should be able to explain the environmental problems associated with invasive species and strategies to control them. Again, very similar to endangered species in that, do I know all of the endangered species? Do I know all of the invasive species? No. Do I understand why a species becomes invasive? Yes. Do I understand how we can start to control species that become invasive? Yes. So that's what I'm going to try to explain to you. So what does it mean to be an invasive species? Well, they get a lot of different names. The idea of invasives also sometimes referred to as introduced, exotic, alien, non-native. All of those terms are used to describe the same thing. Species that is found in an area, but is not native to that area. So sometimes they have an economic benefit to the area, usually not. Okay, most invasive species do not have an economic benefit to an area, but there are some that were purposely introduced to help fund something, maybe to help keep some sort of economy stabilized and going. Oftentimes, they outcompete a lot of our native species for resources, mainly due to the fact that their populations can grow unchecked. And that's a big thing we're going to talk about. So let's first start talking about beneficial introduced species. We talked about it earlier in the year when I talked about honeybees being considered an invasive species. Well, they are an introduced species. They're not truly detrimental. But what honeybees have done is they've outcompeted a lot of our native pollinator species. And we've built our economy around the idea of finding honeybees to pollinate our crops. If you ever go to an orchard or any farm, oftentimes you will see an apiary, which is the wooden boxes for bees, a beekeeper setup, or beehives. All those sorts of things are the same thing. And what they're doing is they're trying to keep high levels of bees there so that they can go and pollinate. When the flowers, like an apple orchard, when all the apple blossoms bloom, they want to make sure they get pollinated. The more pollinated the flowers get, the more that are going to then produce apples. So if you only get 50% of them populated, well, you're only going to get 50% apples. If you can get all of them pollinated, then you're going to have a lot more apples. So it's really important to have these pollinators. If we removed all the honeybees from our population right now, we would see an economic collapse of farmers because they'd have to go out by hand and pollinate because there is nothing to fill that niche right now. We could talk about things like cattle. Cattle is the basis of a lot of our agricultural system. Actually, it's a very interesting argument if we were to get rid of cattle in the United States, because more of our fields and our farmlands go to growing crops for cattle than it does for humans. Think about that. The idea that we farm more for animals that we eat than we do for humans ourselves. So, an interesting look around that. And the part of the other problem is that the dairy lobby and the American beef packers lobby are so large and so powerful, it's really hard for people to think outside of not having cattle. And the idea that, everyone grows up thinking, oh, you have to have milk. Like right now, if I ask you, why do you need milk? You're probably thinking in your head, I need milk for calcium. Well, that's not the only way you can get calcium. You can get calcium in far other ways. And actually, there's studies coming out now. They're showing the milk that you get from a lot of these mass-produced areas. This movie called Forks Over Knives documents it, is that it actually can be detrimental to your bones because it's the way it's binded and other things. I didn't really pay, or I watched a while ago. I don't really recall all the specific details to it, but the idea that you have to drink milk in order to get stronger bones is not the case. There are other ways to get calcium in your diet. So what are some characteristics that allow a species to become invasive? This is a big thing to understand. And I'm going to kind of briefly mention them now because we'll mention them again in a couple lessons. One, Invasive species are often generalist species, meaning they can survive in a wide variety of habitats. They eat a wide variety of foods. They can adapt to a wide variety of climatic conditions. They're generalized, and therefore they're allowed to survive. One of the best examples is like a raccoon. Raccoons are found in all sorts of different habitats. They eat a lot of different things. Like, so if I took a raccoon over to another habitat it's not normally found in, it could often, most likely it will thrive as long as it has a mate to reproduce with. It'll be able to grow. Now, if it doesn't have any, if it has a predator to keep it in check, well, that's fine. But sometimes they don't have predators, or the native predators don't recognize this animal, don't know what to do with it, so they're not going to eat it, and therefore it allows that population to grow unchecked. So that kind of goes to the third bullet, the idea of talking about natural predators. The second topic is another thing we're going to talk about. It's our selected species. Our selected addresses the reproductive structure, or the reproductive strategy, not structure. Reproductive strategy is the better term. I don't know why I said structure. Some organisms take a long time to reproduce, and they have a long gestation period. And then not only that, they also then spend a lot of time raising their young to adulthood. There are other organisms which produce very, very rapidly and don't spend a lot of time on their offspring. Organisms that reproduce really rapidly are selected species. So they have lots of offspring at a time, knowing that in their native habitats, those offspring will be consumed by predators. In a new habitat, you don't have those predators, so the eggs might not get eaten, and therefore they're all able to hatch. So instead of seeing maybe only 5 or 10% success rate, now you're seeing 90 to 100% success rate, and it means that population is going to grow even faster than in ideal conditions back in their own native environments. How do you control invasive species? This is actually really hard to do. It is very hard to control invasive species because they're introduced through a wide variety of measures. One of the biggest and most obvious things is education. Anytime you have to inform someone or you're trying to control something, education is a key component in it. So whether it be signage, whether it be commercials or videos, or who knows, social media is probably going to start to become an avenue to start getting news out a lot more easily. It can work as long as you get people properly informed. Sometimes spamming them with too many things to worry about can be very problematic. So some of the things we talk about, especially in our globalized society, is that we have to kind of get this message out there. But there's so many different ways things are being spread, whether it be seeds. Like, you might go hiking in Europe and you get to step in a bunch of mud and whatnot, and you bring your shoes back and you don't clean them off until you get back here in America. And maybe there's seeds stuck in that mud, and now those seeds are washed away into our local waterways, eventually find their way into some sort of soil, and then they germinate and grow. And now you just introduced a new species into our area. Or like a boat maybe has a piece of algae or some other aquatic plant attached to it, and you go from one, or the trailer, you go from one body of water to another. Now you're spreading that from one body of water to the next. And if it can be invasive and grow very, very rapidly, again, without predators. So it's very, very hard. Most invasive species are introduced accidentally, but some are actually introduced on purpose because it's either something economically beneficial to someone. So when we talk about invasive species, we often talk about this, the invasion curve. And the invasion curve is a little bit hard to see, but let me at least kind of draw some key points on here. Now, when we talk about the invasion curve, what we're really looking at is time. So time being on the bottom axis here, what you see is as we go from left to right, more time is taking place, and then the area infested being on your y-axis. So initially, a species just kind of appears. It's introduced. So that's right here, the introduction. And from there, as long as it has conditions to reproduce, being a mate, if it's an animal, or able to enough sunlight to germinate and grow and produce seeds, as a plant, it will start to grow. And that population is going to kind of travel with the idea of area infestation. So the population goes up. Now, the thing that's going to happen is we need to eradicate it early. If you do not eradicate it, remove all of it early, it's just going to come back to this stage and then you're going to be back here shortly thereafter. But if you do get rid of it, you're good. Very easy to do with fauna, animals. All right. If you find, like, hypothetically, we find an African elephant just walking around, we can get rid of that. All right. That's easy to find. Now, not everything's that big and obvious. Sometimes it's small. Sometimes it's like maybe like a crayfish. There's a common crayfish that's starting to become invasive in a lot of our areas and outcompeting our native crayfish. How did it spread? Well, people used it as fishing bait. And when they would go fishing, if they were done, they just throw it back in the water. So it became, and now it's starting to spread. Now, there's a point where you're like, okay, we can't eradicate it. That's honestly, that's probably where we're at with the spotted lanternfly. We're not getting rid of it anymore. Like, there's no way. But can we contain it? Can we stop it from spreading more? Yeah, we can do that. So let's try to establish the borders, establish checkpoints, and have people being hyper vigilant for it. And then as we work our way up, if we don't contain it, if we don't get to it early enough, now we are in a major long-term management problem. Because not only does long-term management mean that we're not really going to get rid of it, it also means it's going to cost a lot more money. As you go up this chart with the area infested, it's also going to increase the costs. So it's really important, especially for invasive species, for us to get on them early and to make sure that we don't release them in the first place is the best. But besides that, making sure we identify and remove what we can when we can. So what are some purposefully introduced species and how does that actually happen? We know it's not good, so how does it happen? Well, it's usually for aesthetics. Again, the visual beauty of things. People put things in as ornamental landscaping. Now, when I refer to ornamental, I'm talking about your yards around your house that people want to have look a certain way. If you walked around your yard right now and wrote down every plant that's in there, you probably have, I'd say 50% of the plants are probably from another region of the world. So you have, in theory, invasive species. Now, they could spread, all right, if they're not properly contained. Does anyone have bamboo in their yard? If you have bamboo, you know that spreads crazy, and that is an invasive species to our area. We don't have predators that consume it. So if anyone ever has bamboo in their yard, you'll know that it's pretty much impossible to get rid of. It's going to cost you thousands of dollars to get rid of it. So that was planted, though, ornamentally, usually because it looked cool. Now, there's other things, like some things have been released because of economic value. People like to go hunting for these things. So they have ranches and farms which raise these animals and then have them on large preserves of land, and people go out hunting them. Well, if they don't kill them and they are able to reproduce and breed, well, now their population is going to go up. So from the farm's end, they're probably like, all right, this is great. More people come out and hunt more because now we have more of them to hunt. But if they get off of that farm, which like Russian wild boar, Eurasian boar has done, they can spread rapidly and it can be very detrimental to the surrounding habitats. And then it can just continue to spread and spread and spread. Culture is a weird one, especially when I use the example here, the European starling. The European starling was introduced to Central Park because there was a group of people that felt that every bird mentioned in a Shakespeare play should be in Central Park. And now the European starling is arguably the most abundant bird in North America. It has been reproducing prolifically. It lives with humans with no problem and just has been spreading with very, very few predators controlling it. And then there's some that were introduced as a biological control for other species. The example I'm going to use is the cane toad. You guys are going to watch a video, one of my favorite videos I show this year, called Cane Toads, and it talks about cane toads. It's a documentary from Australia about why they were introduced. And then it literally talks about how come they're the perfect invasive species. But cane toads were introduced. They've actually been also introduced into like Miami and southern Florida. But they were introduced to eat the cane beetle, which was eating sugar cane. The problem was the cane beetle wasn't on the ground where the cane toad is, and became very, very problematic and actually didn't control the beetle. But they had already introduced all of these to try to control the beetle. And now it's just spread through northeastern Australia all over the place. Let's talk about some invasive species that were accidentally introduced. And I mentioned it earlier, the rusty crayfish, this crayfish that was used as fishing bait. If you're all done fishing, nobody wants to bring the bait home. It's going to just smell. So you just throw whatever's left, worms, different things like that. You just throw it in the water and something will eat it. Well, what if that crayfish gets into the water, then quickly finds its way to a safe spot and doesn't get eaten? Well, now it's able to survive. What if it was pregnant? What if it was a female and now it's able to lay its eggs and spread? So it becomes very, very problematic. So people are worried about that. Sometimes you'll see things like this signage, like goldfish. People get a pet goldfish and they're like, "Oh, this is great. I love my pet goldfish." But the problem is they get big. They get way too big too quick sometimes. They outgrow their aquarium. If you give it perfect conditions, it'll continue to grow until really it shouldn't anymore. And they're like, "Oh, we're just gonna, release it in the local pond because that's the ethical thing to do." Parents all the time will take kids down to the local pond or creek or river and dump the local little fish in there. And most of the time that fish will die. But sometimes that fish survives, and that fish is hardy enough to survive, and then it goes on to reproduce, and now it outcompetes all the native fish in that area. Seeds are one of the hardest things to control. Like I talked about, like seeds being trapped in your shoes, or like maybe on the tires of a car, driving from a different area, or like on a boat, stuff like that. They were originally, like, a lot of vegetative material was used as packing material. So like dried grass would be used as packing material to ship things across the world prior to the advent of styrofoam and these little air packets that we now use. But they were using dried grass material, and in that dried grass material is seed, and then that seed now spread. And that's why we have pretty common invasive species around here from dried packing material. A lot of times you will see signage like this saying stopping aquatic hitchhikers because we're afraid of, especially in small little bodies of water, transporting invasive species from one to the other. Oftentimes aquatic invasive species can outcompete the natives, really disrupting food chains more than most terrestrial ecosystems. But how do you prevent it? Well, you got to wash your vehicles off. So once you pull your boat out of the water, before you go to another body of water, you're supposed to clean it very well. On my road trip, when we were driving across the country, especially when we got out west in the Northwest, in order for us to go across state lines, if you were pulling a boat, they were forcing boats to pull over at not rest areas, but checkpoints, where the local Fish and Wildlife Services were out there spraying your boat down with like a bleach or an algicide to make sure you weren't transferring any plants from one body of water to the next. So it's starting to be aware. Again, people need to learn about this stuff in order to stop it from happening. Sometimes you'll hear about ship ballast, large ships, big oceanic cargo ships that carry things, back and forth, back and forth. And how do they transport invasive species? And they transport it through something called their ballasts. Now, understanding what a ship ballast is, it's a container, it's an open space, usually in the hull of the ship, that they'll flood with water. And when it's empty, the boat sits higher in the water. When it's full, the boat sinks lower. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, a boat will sit high when it's coming into port because it's shallow water. Right? You don't want to be scrubbing the ground. But it wants to sit low when it's out in the open ocean because it's going to be more stabilized. Because as big waves come along or rogue winds, stuff like that, you don't want to be really top heavy as a cargo ship or you'll fall over or sink or capsize. So they fill their ballast and they sit lower in the water, so they're more stabilized. They have a lower center of gravity and they're less likely to capsize if a rogue wave were to hit them or something like that. Now, if you read through this graphic, you'll see what they do is they pull in water when they're empty at a port, and then they'll drive back to another port where then they will pump that water out as they pull into the port. Well, pumping in and pumping out, you could bring in, planktonic life forms or surface little small plant life, different things like that can get sucked into the ballast. And if it's a quick drive, it's not too bad. they can pump out, and then they'll survive and be in a new area. So it's actually remarkable to think that this is how different organisms are being transported, but it's true. This is how things get transported around the world. We live in a globalized society. No longer is it just the United States independent. That's how a lot of things are moving, because we are constantly moving people around, around the world. So how do we control introduced species? We talked about preventing them. Well, now let's talk about how do we control them. It's not easy. Once they're established, it costs a lot of money and a lot of time to control an invasive species. Oftentimes, there's a lot of research that goes into figuring out their life history, their life cycle, and how they go about being so detrimental to the native populations. One of the things that we need to understand is, how does it reproduce? When does it reproduce? What are its natural predators? All of those things help us to control it. And once you get all that information, you'll start to bring public awareness, and you'll start to try to identify ways to control it. You might be like, hey, listen, everyone goes out in this habitat. If you find it, you're going to start to detect it. Maybe like the spotted lanternfly, you have hotlines where people are calling them in to kind of get an idea of where they are at and what populations they are at. Maybe it's introducing their native predator, which I know is like introducing another invasive species to control one. But in theory, if you've done enough research on that native predator, it's now going to minimize the disruption of this invasive species. So there's so many different things. Feral species. Feral species are species that are generally domesticated that have been released into the wild. And there's a lot of people that treat them differently. I have my own personal opinion about things, and I'm sorry if it comes off very, very harsh, but things like cats should not be outside ever. Or if a cat goes outside, it should have a bell around its neck or some sort of noise-making device, because that cat is probably going to cause, it's going to go out and kill. That's what it's going to do. And it's going to kill birds, it's going to kill small rodents, it's going to kill reptiles, all just kind of sometimes for play. It doesn't need it for food. Cats account for billions of bird deaths every year. People letting cats outside, or people having cats in their community just roaming around, they cause immense trouble. So please, if you have a pet cat, keep it inside. If you want to watch some videos, they are a little violent. They're not necessarily the most pleasant, but they are things you need to hear. But there's two different videos here. They're on Vice, which does a good job of really kind of making good documentaries now. But the one is on cats in Australia, and it's pretty violent. The other one is on feral hogs in Texas. Feral hogs are like those Eurasian boars I was talking about that were brought over for hunting, but now have been running rampant through Texas and other things. Now, over the next couple slides, I'm going to kind of talk to you about invasive species, specific invasive species. There's usually a video attached to each one, so you can click on that video at your own discretion. Why am I showing you so many different invasive species examples? It's because I want you to kind of understand trends, different trends that are happening, and why different species are becoming invasive. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the kudzu vine. Kudzu vine is a very, very rapidly growing vine found in the American South right now. It was introduced. It can grow and cover an entire field in a year very, very rapidly. And obviously it's a vine, so it goes up trees, then pretty much blocks out all sunlight from getting to the native plants. Very, very detrimental. A little video here about how a local college, or not local, but a small college, is using goats, because goats are pretty prolific eaters, to actually control the kudzu vine. It's not eradicating the kudzu vine. It's just controlling it. They're at the point where they can't eradicate it. It's too expensive. How are we going to best manage this? And what they're going to do is now they realize that goats will eat a lot of it, so they're going to be releasing goats in the fields to help control it. The European starling, little video, the history of the European starling, which I kind of mentioned, but if you want to hear it from someone else, feel free to chime in or to check that out. It's a very short little video, I think only like 3 or 4 minutes long, goes over how they actually got introduced and why they were introduced. The lionfish. The lionfish is an incredible, beautiful looking fish, but it's got venomous spikes on it, and it is very detrimental to our coral reef and our coastal ecosystem, especially down near Florida. What happened to get the lionfish introduced was that when Hurricane Andrew in 1992, I believe, came through, it destroyed an outdoor aquarium in Orlando, and the lionfish that were in that outdoor aquarium made their way out into the open ocean, where they then have been kind of reproducing and spreading. There's a lot of easy to catch invasive species. There's almost like, I don't want to call them redneck games, but there's a lot of community games to go out and catch these things. And there's a lot of contests to go see who can catch the most lionfish in a day, or feral hogs, or different things like that. The brown tree snake was introduced to Guam and pretty much ate up and killed off all the native birds on Guam. And it's a very interesting little video to watch there, talking about how it was able to be introduced. And then pretty much there's like a lot of stories about you don't hear songbirds in Guam anymore. And it used to be apparently one of the most beautiful tropical environments. But ever since the snake it was introduced, which I believe it came in through the U.S., one of the U.S. militaries, either the Army or the Navy, has been reproducing prolifically. The Burmese python, I'm going to focus in on the Burmese python a little bit here. Again, starts as like a pet. Everyone gets a little snake as a pet, a foot long, whatnot, and then eventually gets up to 3 feet long. You're like, all right, my goodness, and it's getting big. I don't know what to do with this. I don't want this snake anymore. I'm going to college. Something like that. So they release it. And down in Florida, they're able to survive. It's a warm enough environment. It's very similar to their native environment in Burma, hence Burmese, which is right near Vietnam and South Asia. But you can kind of look here. I have some different charts to show you different things and how the Florida Everglades their food web has been changed because of the Burmese python. All of a sudden now you have an apex predator introduced to an area, so it's just eating and consuming everything. It's destroying ecosystems. At the bottom there, that chart, you can see when they collect and catch Burmese pythons, they keep track of their length, and you can see the distribution. I think this was 1,000 Burmese python. When they hit their 1,000th Burmese python, they kept a track of the length of those Burmese pythons. And you see, for the most part, they're falling in between 6 and 11 feet long snakes. Yes, 6 to 11 foot long snakes, but you see some of them up in the 15 to 17 foot or 17 plus foot long snakes. I'm not a huge snake fan. That doesn't sound like anything I would want to deal with. 17-foot long snake is a definite, I'm going to go the other direction type animal to encounter. Here's some more infographics. I really like infographics. I feel like it's just sometimes just information vomit, just so much stuff thrown at you at once, but some of them they're just really catchy from a visual standpoint. So you can see though, how's the Florida Everglades population is changing, and you look at their mammal populations in there, and you can see things like the raccoon populations have gone down 99%, possums down 99%. Why? Because they're being caught by this predator they're not used to seeing. All right, rabbits going down. Now, foxes probably aren't necessarily always getting caught by the Burmese python, but foxes eat those other things. So if they're getting caught, there's nothing for them to really eat then. So their population is going to die. Here's an interesting one. You can kind of see the number of pythons removed yearly, and you can see it just keeps going up and up and up. So it's really interesting. And where are the Florida Everglades? Very southern tip of Florida, down here. Again, tropical environment pretty much, and it's able to support a lot of tropical species that are introduced to that area. So like cane toads are also found in southern Florida. I don't know if they're necessarily in the Everglades, but I know they're all around Miami. The spotted lanternfly, if you haven't killed one, go out this weekend and kill one, or 1,000. They are kind of hard to step on. They do jump and fly, but they kind of look pretty cool. but they're actually going to start to eat through a lot of our crops. So if you're a farmer in the area, you're really worried about this lanternfly eating through a lot of your crops. But you can see it goes through its different life cycles there, from the black and white nymph stage up to the red, black, and white nymph stage, and then eventually to the full adult. Which again, they're very laborious flyers. They've flown into me, like, just as I'm walking around, just hit me by accident. So try your best to kill them. A simple shoo does a good job. If you want, I highly recommend maybe going out, getting yourself a Gatorade. Drink the Gatorade so you're hydrated. Then spend the day outside catching them. Use the Gatorade bottle. You can kind of just go right over it, and they jump inside of the bottle. It's like a stupid little way to get caught, but it works. I've seen it work very well. Different things like that. Idlewood, if you wondered, is full of lanternflies. Like, if you want to go to Idlewood, just be careful where you walk, because the next slide is going to address some of that. But you can kill off a lot of the lanternflies there, and I won't stop you one bit. The emerald ash borer is what's destroying Idlewood. It is killing off our ash trees. Now, Idlewood and most of Pennsylvania is home to ash. Ash is a very famous deciduous tree, used a lot for handles because it's a really strong wood. Now, Idlewood, for example, was somewhere between 7 and 12% ash trees. So about 1 in every 10 trees in Idlewood. And in different areas, it's like 90% ash trees. So it's just mainly all dead in some spots. But over all of Idlewood, it's between 7 and 12% ash. And those ash are now all dead and they're standing. That's why Idlewood is closed, because they're dead standing timber. So we don't have the money right now to go out and cut down all those trees to allow you to walk through Idlewood. Now, I know the fear of a tree falling on you is pretty low, but if you did get hurt, that's my job is on the line. So that's why I'm telling you, only know where you're going and watch where you're going. Don't ever go out there in windy weather or stormy weather, just because we don't know the health of the trees. You'll see there are a lot of trees down in Idlewood, and if you look and you see the inside of their trunks, some of them are hollowed out. That's because they've been dying for a while from the emerald ash borer, and it's really gotten exceptionally bad over the past 3 to 4 years. Asian carp were introduced into catfish farms along the Mississippi River. They're in the catfish farms to eat the algae and all the excess waste there. They're bottom feeders. They're just notorious for eating a lot of different things. The one thing about when I say Asian carp is there's actually multiple species of carp that we all lump into this Asian carp family. Big head carp, silver carp, among others. There's like 5 or 6 of them that are common in the United States. They're famous because as you run a motorboat near the water, they jump out of the water. The silver carp will jump out of the water. And actually, some of them can get quite big, to like 15, 20 pounders. So imagine riding like a jet ski or something like that down the Mississippi River, and all of a sudden this 15-pound weight just jumps in front of you and hits you right in the chest. It'll probably hurt a little bit. Could probably knock most of you off a jet ski. But that's not really the whole problem. But the big problem is them getting into the Great Lakes. They're right on the border of the Great Lakes. We believe some of them might have already got into the Great Lakes, and they can destroy the Great Lake ecosystem because of the way they eat so much food and reproduce so rapidly with no predator. The next slide here has a video, again, by Vice, talking all about the Asian carp and why they're so detrimental and different ways in which people kind of control them. Right now, one of the big things, especially with a lot of invasive species, is can you find an economic benefit for them? Not for them surviving, but maybe as harvested. Can we serve fish as food? Maybe can we harvest as many Asian carp as we can and use it as, I don't know, dog food or other food for another animal? That's another purpose. Like mesquite trees in Texas, incredibly invasive. But people found out that they are really, really good for barbecue wood. So if you ever barbecue or you're on a smoker, you've probably heard of mesquite as a flavoring. It's a great wood. It produces a nice flavored smoke. And people have been now using mesquite trees for that. So they actually have a reason to go out and cut down the trees. Zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are very, very small, prolific reproducers. They grow very, very rapidly. They leave lots of their shells behind, and they grow in really, really dense clusters, which can be dangerous if you're walking on anything like that. They start to damage a lot of our aquatic infrastructure, whether it be pipelines that connect waterways, different areas. They grow on boat motors and stuff like that. So if it's been in the water for so long, it'll actually stop it and block it from running. It can clog pipes for intake water. So if you need drinking water or whatnot and you can't get the intake, it becomes very, very problematic. Purple loosestrife is very, very common around here. Purple loosestrife is this beautiful little plant, but it was introduced to help control wetlands and to stabilize lands. And now we see it growing pretty much anywhere you have water found with soil conditions, like along like 95 when you're driving there, that little grassy belt in the middle. If you go to Silver Lake Nature Center, you will see there's tons of purple loosestrife all growing at Silver Lake. They've taken over the wetlands and outcompeted all the native species for different resources. And that brings me to the end of this PowerPoint. Now, what I want to kind of address here with invasive species is an invasive species is a species that comes to a new area, or is introduced to a new area, and then prolifically grows. And remember that every living thing, whether it's invasive, endangered, whatnot, it still has different things it needs. It needs those limiting resources: food, water, shelter, depending on the type of organism, whatnot, habitat to grow in. Now, an invasive species will oftentimes outcompete the native species. Now, why is it able to outcompete the native species? Because it's often generalist. Okay, we do have many native generalist species, but it can also grow so well without any predators. That is the biggest thing, that all of these invasive species do not have predators. If they had predators or native predators that could control them here, then they would not be growing as prolifically. Now, if you fully comprehend and understand how invasive species work, that is awesome, and I am excited because that means I can move on to my next topic. If you don't know what's going on, you know you can always send me a message somehow, get a hold of me. If you want to talk, let's set something up. We'll go through and discuss how come you don't necessarily truly understand invasive species, or maybe you just have some questions about them, more advanced questions that I can hopefully answer. If not, that's awesome, and I look forward to seeing you guys at the next lesson. But make sure you watch the movie Cane Toads, which I'm going to be posting for you guys. I thoroughly enjoy it. I think you will enjoy it. It's almost like a mockumentary, but it's really well done, especially if you look at it from why are cane toads so invasive. I look forward to seeing you guys with the next lesson, where we're going to continue on talking about the AP Environmental Science curriculum and moving our way through this. So in the meantime, have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye-bye.
You like that lesson? I know you did. So why don't you go ahead and smash that like button right now. Go ahead and comment. Tell all your friends about how great that lesson was. And make sure you subscribe, because I'm going to keep bringing you AP environmental content that you're going to want to watch. Or do whatever else those other YouTube channels tell you to do. And with that, Maloney.